Do you remember those breakfasts from your childhood? The ones that made mornings feel special? These were the dishes you could only find in family kitchens or old handwritten cookbooks, not online blogs. From sweet rolls to hearty grits, each meal carried a story and a memory. Let's take a trip back to those mornings seniors still remember, one plate at a time.
Cornmeal mush, fried into breakfast cakes. Long before cereal came in brightly colored boxes, before frozen waffles popped from toasters, families in rural America were waking up to a humble but filling dish known as cornmeal mush. At its simplest, cornmeal mush was nothing more than ground corn slowly simmered in water or milk until it thickened into a porridge. It was a dish born of necessity, beloved not for its glamour but for its reliability. When money was scarce and pantries were lean, a sack of cornmeal could stretch for weeks, feeding a household morning after morning. Farmers, mill workers, and school children alike started their days with it, knowing it would stick to their ribs until lunchtime. The beauty of cornmeal mush was in its versatility. Freshly cooked, it resembled a hot cereal, often sweetened with a drizzle of molasses or honey, if such luxuries were on hand. But the real magic happened the next morning, when yesterday's leftovers were poured into a pan, cooled into a firm loaf, and then sliced into slabs ready for the skillet. Fried in bacon grease or butter, these golden cakes took on a crispy crust while staying soft in the middle, creating a breakfast that was both hearty and comforting. Many old-timers recall the smell of cornmeal cakes sizzling in the pan as the unofficial alarm clock of childhood. Emotionally, cornmeal mush carried more than just calories. It carried memory. It was a symbol of thrift, of mothers and grandmothers who knew how to stretch one ingredient into many meals, and of families who sat around tables where nothing was wasted. To some, it might have been the food of hard times, but to others, it was the taste of home. Today, in a world where brunch menus feature avocado toast and $15 stacks of pancakes, cornmeal mush might seem quaint or forgotten. Yet, in its simplicity, it reflects the same spirit that fuels modern trends toward sustainability and waste-free cooking. In fact, fried cornmeal cakes could easily make a comeback on TikTok, marketed as Depression-era polenta fries or Grandma's crispy corn cakes. Nostalgic, frugal, and surprisingly trendy, cornmeal mush proves that sometimes yesterday's breakfasts are still worth waking up for.
Biscuits with sausage gravy. Few breakfasts are as deeply tied to Southern kitchens and farmhouse tables as biscuits with sausage gravy. This dish was never about elegance. It was about resourcefulness and heartiness, a way to turn simple pantry staples into a meal that could carry a person through a long day of labor. At its core, it began with the biscuit, tender and flaky, often made from nothing more than flour, lard, baking powder, and milk. Farmers' wives or grandmothers would rise before the sun to cut the dough into rounds and slide them into a hot oven, filling the house with the unmistakable aroma of baking bread. The gravy was born of thrift, too. Bits of sausage, sometimes the scraps too small or fatty to be sold at market, were browned in a skillet, their drippings becoming the foundation for what came next. A handful of flour whisked into the grease, followed by milk, created a creamy, pepper-speckled sauce that stretched a little meat into something that could feed an entire family. It was rich without being extravagant, proof that comfort could be coaxed from even the humblest of ingredients. Poured generously over warm biscuits, the dish was hearty enough to satisfy farm hands headed to the fields or children preparing for a long school day. Beyond its practicality, biscuits with sausage gravy carried a kind of ritual. Families gathered at the table, coffee steaming in chipped mugs, biscuits split open to catch every drop of that savory gravy. For many seniors today, it remains a symbol of togetherness, of Sundays after church, or of grandparents who never let anyone leave the table hungry. Modern breakfast culture often leans toward convenience, protein shakes, breakfast bars, drive-through sandwiches, but biscuits and gravy still hold their ground. In fact, they've become a nostalgic star of diners and brunch spots, where what was once considered poor man's food now commands a proud place on the menu. It's funny how trends circle back. What was once a meal of survival now gets praised for being authentic and comforting. Maybe that's because no matter how fast-paced our mornings become, there's something timeless about a plate of warm biscuits smothered in creamy sausage gravy. It whispers of slower mornings, fuller tables, and the kind of satisfaction you can't box up or microwave. Scrapple, Mid-Atlantic thrift breakfast. Scrapple is one of those breakfasts that proves the old saying, waste not, want not. Born out of the thrift and practicality of Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens, Scrapple took the parts of a pig that no one else wanted, head, heart, liver, and odds and ends, and turned them into something that could not only feed a family, but become a beloved tradition. After boiling the pork scraps into a rich broth, cooks would stir in cornmeal, flour, and spices, creating a thick, porridge-like mixture that was then poured into a loaf pan to cool and set. The next morning, it was sliced and fried until the outside was crispy and browned, while the inside stayed soft, savory, and deeply satisfying. For farm families in the Mid-Atlantic, scrapple wasn't a delicacy, it was a necessity. Every part of the animal was used, and nothing was wasted. What could have been seen as scraps became the centerpiece of breakfast, especially when paired with eggs or drizzle of molasses on the side. It was filling, frugal, and practical, the very definition of survival food that turned into comfort food. Many children who grew up in the region remember waking up to the smell of scrapple frying in cast iron, its distinctive sizzle announcing breakfast long before they reached the table. Scrapple also carried cultural weight. Rooted in German immigrant traditions, it linked families to their heritage while adapting to the resources of the New World. It wasn't just food, it was history on a plate, connecting generations who all shared the same crispy-edged loaf at breakfast. Today, scrapple can be polarizing. Some recoil at the thought of mystery meat, while others insist it's the best part of a hearty breakfast. In an age where nose-to-tail cooking is celebrated by chefs and foodies, scrapple suddenly seems ahead of its time. What was once a humble way to stretch ingredients now fits neatly into conversations about sustainability and culinary authenticity. Perhaps that's why, in diners from Philadelphia to Baltimore, scrapple still earns its spot on the griddle. It may have started as thrift, but for many seniors, it remains the taste of home. Crispy, comforting, and impossible to forget. Johnny cakes, early American corn cakes. Johnny cakes may look simple on the plate, but they carry centuries of American history in every golden bite. Long before diners and fast food chains decided what breakfast should be, cornmeal was the backbone of many households, and Johnny cakes were a reliable way to turn that humble ingredient into something warm, filling, and portable. Their origins stretch back to Native American cooking, where ground corn was mixed with water and baked on hot stones. Early colonists quickly adopted the practice, adapting it to cast iron pans and griddles, giving rise to the Johnny cake we know today. Some regions called them journey cakes, since they could be carried along the road, while others swore the name came from a slurring of Shawnee cake. Whatever the origin of the word, the food itself was pure thrift and practicality. Made with little more than cornmeal, salt, and water, or milk if it was available. Johnny cakes were sturdy enough to keep a farmer satisfied until midday. They could be eaten plain, with butter melting into their coarse texture, or sweetened with molasses, honey, or maple syrup, if the family had some on hand. Unlike delicate pancakes, Johnny cakes were dense, hearty, and built for endurance. They weren't meant to be fancy. They were meant to get you through a day of chopping wood, tilling soil, or walking miles to school. For many seniors who grew up in New England or along the eastern seaboard, Johnny cakes weren't just breakfast. They were a family tradition. Grandmothers mixed batter by feel rather than measurement, passing down the art of getting the texture just right. Some preferred them crisp around the edges, others thick and chewy in the middle, but all agreed that Johnny cakes tasted best hot from the skillet. Today, Johnny cakes have slipped into the background of American food culture, overshadowed by fluffy buttermilk pancakes and Belgian waffles. Yet they remain a powerful reminder of resilience and simplicity. In an age of food trends and viral recipes, Johnny cakes could easily make a comeback as heritage cooking or gluten-free corn cakes. After all, they embody what many are rediscovering. Food doesn't have to be complicated to be meaningful. It just has to be honest, nourishing, and rooted in memory. Fried potatoes and onions. Few breakfast dishes have the ability to bridge the gap between humble necessity and pure comfort the way fried potatoes and onions do. In kitchens across America, especially in rural and working-class homes, this dish was less a recipe and more a ritual. It began with the simplest of ingredients: leftover potatoes from last night's dinner and an onion or two from the cellar. Sliced thin and tossed into a hot skillet with bacon grease, lard, or later butter and oil. They transformed into something golden, fragrant, and deeply satisfying. The potatoes crisped around the edges while the onions caramelized into sweet, tender ribbons, their flavors melding into a rustic symphony that could make a meager breakfast feel hearty. For families who didn't have the luxury of bacon every morning or couldn't afford a pantry stocked with variety, fried potatoes and onions were the answer. They were filling, reliable, and flexible. A few eggs on the side, or perhaps a biscuit, and you had a meal strong enough to carry you through hours of work in the fields or on the factory floor. In households where food waste wasn't an option, nothing about this dish ever went to waste. Cold boiled potatoes from supper could be sliced and fried the next morning, and those onions, often bought in bulk for cheap, stretched across countless meals. Yet, beyond thrift, there's an emotional warmth to fried potatoes and onions. Many seniors remember the sound of the skillet popping and hissing as the day began, the smell drifting through the house long before the coffee finished perking. It wasn't just breakfast. It was a moment of connection, of family gathered around the table before scattering to school, chores, or work. Modern food culture might call it a hash, or try to dress it up with trendy toppings, but the essence remains the same. It's peasant food, elevated by memory and practicality, timeless in its appeal. While today's breakfasts are often rushed and eaten on the go, fried potatoes and onions remind us of slower mornings when the measure of a good day began with the comfort of a hot skillet and a plate full of golden, crispy goodness. Hot grits with butter or cheese. For many Southerners, the day never truly began until a bowl of hot grits was on the table. Simple, unpretentious, and endlessly comforting, grits were more than just food. They were part of the rhythm of daily life. Made from ground corn, simmered slowly in water or milk until they reached a creamy, porridge-like consistency, Grits were inexpensive, filling, and versatile. Their plainness was precisely their strength because, with just a pat of butter or a sprinkle of cheese, they transformed into something far more satisfying than their humble origins suggested. In rural households, grits were often the first thing stirred on the stove in the gray light of morning. The bubbling pot needed attention and patience, qualities that reflected the unhurried pace of early kitchen work. Families who had little money could still count on grits to fill empty stomachs, and when butter was available, it melted luxuriously into every spoonful. Cheese, whether sharp cheddar, or whatever odds and ends were left from the block, added another layer of indulgence, turning what might have been plain into something worthy of being called a treat. For children, hot grits were often the taste of comfort. Many remember blowing on steaming bowls before taking that first bite, sometimes sweetened with a little sugar, sometimes savory with salt and pepper. They carried the warmth of home and the reassurance that no matter how lean times might be, there would be something on the table in the morning. Seniors often recall how a pot of grits could stretch to feed an entire household, especially when paired with eggs, biscuits, or just a few slices of fried bacon. Today, grits have moved from farmhouse kitchens to upscale brunch menus, often dressed up with shrimp, spices, or artisan cheeses. Yet the soul of the dish hasn't changed. Whether served in a rustic bowl with a dollop of butter melting into a golden pool, or in a cast iron pot with a scattering of sharp cheddar, grits remain timeless. They embody thrift and comfort, simplicity and satisfaction. For those who grew up with them, a spoonful of hot grits is not just breakfast, it's a memory of family tables, warm kitchens, and a way of life rooted in resilience. Molasses on bread. There was a time when breakfast didn't come in a box, didn't involve a drive-through window, and certainly didn't need a dozen ingredients to be considered complete. For many families, especially during lean years like the Great Depression, breakfast could be as simple as a slice of bread with a generous smear of molasses. It was hardly glamorous, but it was affordable, filling, and for countless children, it tasted like comfort. Molasses, a byproduct of sugar refining, was inexpensive and widely available, making it a kitchen staple in households where every penny had to stretch. Its deep, rich sweetness turned an ordinary slice of bread, sometimes fresh from the oven, other times yesterday's loaf, warmed on the stove, into a treat that could carry someone through the morning. Molasses on bread was often the working family's answer to cereal or pastries. It required no preparation beyond spreading, no fuel beyond what was needed to bake the bread itself, and no fuss. For children, it was a breakfast that felt indulgent even if it cost almost nothing. Some remember dunking molasses bread into hot coffee or warm milk, letting the sweetness dissolve into the drink. Others recall how it stained their fingers and lips, leaving them sticky but satisfied before heading off to school or chores. There was also nutrition hiding in that simple pairing. Unlike refined white sugar, molasses carried trace minerals like iron and magnesium, which gave parents the sense that they were putting something wholesome into their children, even if the meal itself was meager. In many rural kitchens, it was a reliable standby, always there, always ready, always cheap. Today, molasses on bread feels almost quaint, overshadowed by Nutella, peanut butter, and 100 flavored spreads lining supermarket shelves. Yet for seniors who grew up with it, the memory is strong. The smell of warm bread, the sticky sweetness, the way something so basic could feel like a luxury. In a culture now chasing artisanal simplicity and heritage ingredients, molasses on bread could easily return as a retro comfort. After all, it reminds us that sometimes the best breakfasts don't come from abundance but from the ability to make the most of what we already have. Fried apples with biscuits. If there was ever a breakfast that managed to feel both practical and indulgent, it was fried apples served alongside warm, fluffy biscuits. This dish was a staple in many Southern and Appalachian kitchens, where apples were plentiful and nothing went to waste. Families would slice up apples, sometimes the ones that were a little too bruised for the table, and toss them into a cast iron skillet with butter, sugar, and a dash of cinnamon or nutmeg if the spice jar wasn't empty. Slowly, the fruit softened and caramelized, filling the kitchen with a fragrance that could rival any bakery. It was the kind of smell that pulled children out of bed faster than any call from their parents ever could. Biscuits, meanwhile, were the dependable companion. Made with flour, lard, and buttermilk if it was available, they were baked until tall and golden, ready to be split open and smothered with those tender, syrupy apples. The pairing wasn't just delicious, it was clever. Biscuits stretched the fruit further, making sure everyone at the table got their share, while the apples turned plain bread into something special. It was a perfect example of how resourceful cooks transformed simple ingredients into meals that felt abundant. For many seniors, fried apples with biscuits carries a strong thread of memory. It recalls mornings in farm kitchens, where a skillet of apples might sit bubbling on the stove while coffee perked in the background. It reminds them of grandmothers who could make magic out of a handful of fruit and a little flour. It wasn't just breakfast, it was comfort, love, and thrift all rolled into one plate. Today, you might see something similar on a brunch menu, marketed as a rustic apple compote with house-made biscuits. But for those who grew up with it, no fancy name could improve on the original. It was about family gathered around the table, eating together before scattering to school, chores, or work. Fried apples with biscuits prove that breakfast didn't need to be complicated to be memorable. Sometimes all it took was a skillet, a few apples, and the patience to let them sizzle into sweetness. Oatmeal with raisins. For generations, oatmeal with raisins was the breakfast that promised both thrift and comfort in one steaming bowl. In the days before instant packets flavored with artificial maple or brown sugar, oatmeal was cooked slowly on the stove, stirred patiently until it thickened into something warm enough to cut through the chill of a winter morning. A scoop of oats, a pinch of salt, and water or milk were all it took to make a pot large enough to feed an entire family. Into this simple base went raisins, sometimes plump and sweet, sometimes a little dry and chewy, depending on how long they had been in the pantry. Together, they transformed the porridge from plain sustenance into something with texture, flavor, and just enough sweetness to feel like a treat. For many families, especially during the lean years of the Great Depression and beyond, oatmeal was an affordable staple. A sack of oats could be stretched into countless breakfasts, and raisins, though modest in cost, provided a spark of variety. Parents believed, rightly so, that it was nourishing, fuel for children headed to school and adults preparing for long hours in the fields or at factory jobs. It was food that filled stomachs and kept bodies warm, a necessity in households where wasting money on frivolous breakfasts simply wasn't an option. And yet, despite its practicality, oatmeal with raisins holds a kind of nostalgic glow. Seniors often recall mornings when the kitchen windows fogged up from the steam rising off the pot, or the way a pat of butter melting into the surface made it rich enough to seem decadent. Some families added a drizzle of molasses or honey if they had it. Others sprinkled in cinnamon, turning the oatmeal into something closer to dessert than duty. In today's world of overnight oats trending on social media, it's easy to forget that oatmeal with raisins was doing the job long before it was fashionable. It was the original wholesome breakfast, nutritious, economical, and endlessly adaptable. For those who grew up with it, one spoonful can bring back the sound of spoons scraping enamel bowls and the reassuring warmth of mornings that started with something both humble and deeply satisfying: powdered eggs. For many seniors who lived through the Second World War or its aftermath, powdered eggs are not just a memory, but a symbol of an era defined by rationing, resilience, and making do with what was available. When fresh eggs were scarce, either because local farms had to send much of their supply overseas to feed soldiers, or because families couldn't afford them, powdered eggs stepped in as the stand-in for the real thing. Made by dehydrating and pulverizing fresh eggs into a shelf-stable powder, they could be stored in tins or boxes for months and reconstituted with water whenever needed. They didn't crack, spoil, or require refrigeration, which made them practical for both households and the military. Of course, practicality and taste are two different things. Ask someone who grew up on powdered eggs and you're likely to get a wry smile and maybe even a grimace. The flavor was often described as faintly metallic or sulfurous, and the texture never quite matched the fluffiness of fresh eggs. Yet, for children in the 1940s and early 1950s, this was breakfast. Scrambled, baked into cakes, or stirred into pancake batter, powdered eggs were everywhere. Families found ways to disguise them with cheese, onions, or even ketchup, turning what might have been bland into something tolerable. Despite their shortcomings, powdered eggs carried a certain pride. Eating them meant you were doing your part for the war effort, saving the best and freshest for the troops overseas. It was a reminder that every kitchen was, in a sense, connected to the front lines, and that sacrifice began at the breakfast table. Seniors often remember mothers or grandmothers speaking of them not as a disappointment, but as a necessity endured with dignity. Today, powdered eggs have shifted from ration food to a niche survivalist or camping staple. They're sold in bulk to hikers, preppers, and institutions that prize their long shelf life. While most of us prefer our eggs fresh and sunny side up, there's something to be said for the resilience symbolized by those yellow tins and cardboard boxes. Powdered eggs weren't about flavor. They were about survival, community, and the quiet determination to keep going one rehydrated breakfast at a time.
Fried bologna sandwiches. There are few breakfasts as unapologetically humble and yet as fondly remembered as the fried bologna sandwich. For many children growing up in the 1940s through the 1970s, this was the quick, satisfying meal that showed up when bacon or sausage wasn't in the budget. Bologna, inexpensive and sold in thick pink rounds, could be stretched to feed a crowd. When fried in a hot skillet, its edges curled up into little cups, the meat browning and crisping just enough to give it character. A slice or two tucked between buttered bread, or better yet, fresh biscuits, was enough to feel like a full meal, even if the ingredient list was short. The beauty of fried bologna sandwiches was in their flexibility. Some families dressed them up with mustard or ketchup, others with a slice of cheese if they had it on hand. For breakfast, the sandwich often appeared alongside a fried egg, making it hearty enough to carry a child through school or a parent through a shift at the mill. The sizzling sound of bologna hitting the pan was a familiar soundtrack in many kitchens, often accompanied by the smell of coffee perking and toast browning. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling. And in times when frugality was necessary, that was all that mattered. For seniors today, fried bologna sandwiches hold a special place in memory. They recall mornings when money was tight, but the kitchen was still full of laughter, or afternoons when a quick fried bologna sandwich was pressed into a child's hand before rushing off to play. It was food that reflected both resourcefulness and care, proof that a meal didn't have to be elaborate to taste like love. Modern tastes may lean toward artisan breakfast sandwiches with smoked meats and sourdough buns, but there's a quiet charm in the old fried bologna classic. It's the kind of dish that doesn't apologize for being simple. It embraces it. In fact, with today's retro food trends, you can even find upscale versions in diners and food trucks, proudly calling back to the meal that once kept so many families going. For many, though, the best version will always be the original. Crisped bologna, soft bread, and the unmistakable flavor of childhood thrift.
Spam and eggs. Spam and eggs may not sound like a glamorous breakfast, but for countless families in the mid-20th century, it was a staple that carried both practicality and comfort. Introduced by Hormel in the late 1930s, Spam quickly became a household name during World War II, when fresh meat was rationed and hard to come by. Its long shelf life, affordable price, and versatility made it indispensable, and soldiers overseas brought their taste for it back home. Before long, frying up a slice of Spam to serve with eggs became a familiar ritual in American kitchens, particularly in working-class households that needed meals to be quick, hearty, and inexpensive. The preparation was as straightforward as it gets. A can of Spam, with its signature metallic pop, revealed a pink loaf that could be sliced thin or thick depending on preference. Once dropped into a hot skillet, the slices crisped at the edges, transforming into something smoky and savory. Paired with eggs, fried, scrambled, or even folded into an omelet, it made for a breakfast that filled stomachs without emptying wallets. The salty richness of the Spam balanced with the simplicity of eggs, and together they offered both protein and satisfaction at the start of the day. For many seniors, Spam and eggs evoke memories of kitchens where mothers and grandmothers stretched every dollar. It wasn't just about eating, it was about resourcefulness, about turning a shelf-stable product into something that felt like a proper meal. In some households, it even became a Sunday favorite. Its sizzling smell, a signal that breakfast was nearly ready. Children grew up associating Spam and eggs with warmth and familiarity, even if it wasn't the most glamorous dish in the world. Today, Spam has enjoyed a surprising resurgence, celebrated in Hawaiian and Asian cuisines, and even embraced by chefs who reimagine it in creative ways. But for seniors who remember those early mornings, the classic pairing with eggs remains unmatched. It is the taste of wartime resilience, post-war practicality, and family kitchens where no one went hungry. Spam and eggs remind us that sometimes the simplest meals carry the deepest sense of history and home. Cream chipped beef on toast. Few breakfast dishes carry as much nostalgia and as many nicknames as creamed chipped beef on toast. For seniors who grew up in the 1940s and 1950s, this dish was both a comfort food and a symbol of practicality. It began with dried, salty slices of beef, often sold in glass jars or packets, which could be stored for long periods without spoiling. When fresh meat was expensive or scarce, chipped beef offered a way to add protein and flavor to a meal without straining the family budget. The beef was shredded into thin strips, then stirred into a creamy white sauce made of milk, flour, and butter or drippings. Poured generously over toast, the result was a hearty breakfast that filled bellies without emptying wallets. For many, the dish carried strong ties to military life. During World War II, soldiers were served creamed, chipped beef on toast so often that it earned the infamous nickname SOS. The less polite version of that acronym made its way into soldiers' jokes. But even with its reputation, it was dependable food that stuck with you through a long day. When veterans returned home, they carried the memory of the dish with them, and it soon became a staple in post-war households. In civilian kitchens, though, it was remembered with more fondness than frustration. For children, creamed chipped beef on toast was a treat. Its salty, creamy richness transforming plain bread into something indulgent. The sauce seeped into the toast, softening it at the bottom while leaving the top slightly crisp, a balance of textures that made every bite comforting. Many seniors remember their mothers stirring the white sauce on the stove, patiently whisking to keep it smooth, while the smell of toasted bread filled the air. Today, creamed chipped beef has become something of a retro dish, appearing occasionally on diner menus or in nostalgic cookbooks. Some dismiss it as old-fashioned, but for those who grew up with it, it's a reminder of resilience, thrift, and family mornings where even the simplest ingredients came together to create comfort. More than just a quirky recipe from the past, it represents how food can nourish both body and memory, long after the last bite is gone. Rice pudding for breakfast. Rice pudding might sound like dessert to modern ears, but for many seniors, it was once a familiar and comforting way to start the morning. In households where nothing could be wasted, yesterday's pot of rice was rarely thrown out. Instead, thrifty cooks transformed those plain grains into a sweet, nourishing dish by simmering them gently with milk, sugar, and a touch of spice. A sprinkle of cinnamon or nutmeg elevated the flavor, while raisins or bits of fruit, if available, added texture and sweetness. Served warm, rice pudding carried the same comforting heft as oatmeal, but with a softer, creamier personality that made it feel almost indulgent. During the lean years of the Depression and wartime rationing, rice pudding became a reliable breakfast. Rice was inexpensive, widely available, and endlessly adaptable. Paired with milk from the family cow or even evaporated milk from the pantry, it could feed a household without straining the budget. Children loved it because it tasted like a treat, far removed from the plain porridge or toast that might otherwise greet them in the morning. Parents appreciated that it filled stomachs and provided enough energy to carry kids through school or chores. In many homes, rice pudding wasn't just food. It was a little reminder that even simple ingredients could bring a touch of sweetness to difficult times. Emotionally, it became tied to family rituals. Some recall the clink of spoons against enamel bowls as steam rose from the pudding, or the way a pat of butter swirled into the milky surface, turning it golden. Grandmothers often prepared it in large pots, making sure there was always enough for second helpings. It was a dish that blurred the line between necessity and comfort, which is perhaps why so many remember it so fondly. Today, rice pudding has mostly been relegated to the dessert menu, but its place at the breakfast table deserves recognition. In an age when overnight oats and chia puddings dominate Instagram feeds, rice pudding seems almost prophetic, an old-fashioned forerunner of the creamy, customizable breakfast bowls we crave now. For those who grew up with it, though, it will always be more than a trend. It was the sweet, humble start to many mornings, proof that even the simplest pantry staples could create warmth and memory. Cold biscuits with syrup or honey. For many seniors, one of the simplest and most satisfying breakfasts wasn't hot off the stove at all, but rather something left over from the day before. cold biscuits drizzled with syrup or honey. In households where baking was done in big batches, biscuits were rarely wasted. They sat in a tin or wrapped in cloth overnight, waiting to be transformed the next morning into a quick meal. Split open and softened with a sweet topping, those humble leftovers became a treat. Proof that frugality could still taste like comfort. The tradition grew out of practicality. In the days before supermarkets and fast food, families relied on what they had, and homemade biscuits were a staple of southern and rural kitchens alike. Fresh biscuits with gravy or butter might appear at supper, but the next day's breakfast often depended on the cooled remnants. Instead of throwing them out, thrifty cooks repurposed them, turning what could have been scraps into something worth savoring. Molasses syrup, cane syrup, or honey, depending on what was available, provided the sweetness, soaking into the crumbly biscuit until each bite was moist, rich, and just sticky enough to delight a child. For many, the memory is bound up with early mornings before school or chores. Children would grab a biscuit, drizzle on honey from the family's hive or syrup from the pantry, and eat it quickly before heading out the door. It was portable, easy, and filling, long before on-the-go breakfast became a marketing buzzword. Some remember the way honey would crystallize on cool mornings, adding a little crunch, or how syrup pooled in the cracks of the biscuit like edible gold. What might sound plain to outsiders was, for those who grew up with it, deeply satisfying. In today's world, where biscuits are often store-bought and breakfast means cereal bars or drive-through sandwiches, the charm of cold biscuits with syrup or honey feels almost radical. It's a reminder that a good breakfast doesn't need a dozen ingredients or fancy presentation. Sometimes all it takes is yesterday's bread and a drizzle of sweetness to start the day with warmth. For seniors who remember, it's a taste of both thrift and tenderness, a reminder that nothing, especially food or family effort, was ever wasted. Flapjacks. Long before pancake houses lined the highways and boxed mixes promised a stack in minutes, flapjacks were the hearty breakfast staple that fueled early American households. They were simple, no fuss, and endlessly adaptable. Just flour, a bit of leavening, milk or water, and a splash of fat whisked into a batter and poured onto a hot skillet. Unlike the perfectly round uniform pancakes we see on diner menus today, flapjacks were often rustic in shape and texture, browned unevenly around the edges, sometimes a little too thick or thin depending on who was manning the griddle. But that was their charm. They didn't need to be perfect. They only needed to be filling. For farm families, flapjacks were the ideal way to start a demanding day. When paired with butter, syrup, or even a spread of jam, they delivered enough energy to carry workers through hours of fieldwork. Kids, of course, loved them because breakfast suddenly felt indulgent. What child wouldn't be thrilled by a stack of warm cakes dripping with sweetness? In fact, for many seniors, the memory of flapjacks is wrapped up in the sound of batter sizzling on a cast iron skillet and the smell of browned edges wafting through the kitchen. It was the kind of breakfast that made a cold morning feel a little brighter. During leaner times, flapjacks also embodied frugality. If milk or eggs were scarce, cooks improvised with water, powdered milk, or even sour cream substitutes. Some recipes bulked them up with cornmeal or oats to make them heartier, proving that necessity often drove creativity. Unlike today's towering restaurant stacks drowned in whipped cream, flapjacks were about sustenance, not spectacle. They were practical food designed to keep stomachs full until the midday meal. In the modern world, flapjacks are often overshadowed by their more polished cousin, the pancake. Yet they're experiencing a quiet revival as people turn back to cast iron cooking and homemade simplicity. There's something deeply grounding about whisking up a quick batter and letting the skillet do its work, knowing you're carrying on a tradition as old as America itself. For seniors, flapjacks weren't just breakfast. They were proof that simple ingredients, handled with care, could create warmth, comfort, and memories that stick as firmly as syrup on a plate. Waffles with Caro syrup. For many seniors, the memory of waffles drizzled with Caro syrup evokes mornings filled with both anticipation and the cozy smell of home. Long before frozen waffles made their way from freezer to toaster in minutes, waffles were often a labor of love. Batter was mixed from scratch, poured into a cast iron waffle iron, and cooked over a stovetop or open flame until golden and crisp. The texture was thick and satisfying, with pockets perfectly designed to hold syrup, butter, or a sprinkle of sugar. It wasn't a quick convenience food, it was a breakfast that required patience, but the payoff was undeniable. Caro syrup, the dark, rich corn syrup widely available in American households, was the crowning touch. Sweet, sticky, and affordable, it transformed waffles from a simple, hearty food into something indulgent. Many families relied on it because it was shelf-stable, inexpensive, and could be used in a variety of recipes beyond breakfast, from pies to glazes. A warm waffle slathered with butter and Caro syrup was simple, yes, but it carried a sense of celebration. Even on ordinary mornings, children remember dragging the skillet from the stove to the table, syrup dripping down the sides, and eagerly diving in while it was still hot. Waffles with Caro syrup also reflect a culture of thrift and resourcefulness. In households where eggs, sugar, or milk were scarce, the batter might be stretched with a bit of water or flour, and a small amount of syrup could flavor the whole batch. It was a dish that balanced indulgence and practicality, creating satisfaction without extravagance. Today, waffles are often associated with brunch menus, fancy toppings, and Instagram-worthy presentations. Yet for those who grew up with the simple tradition of Caro syrup, nothing compares. It's the taste of family kitchens, where breakfast was a shared ritual and the effort of cooking was rewarded by warmth, fullness, and a little sweetness. Waffles with Caro syrup remind us that sometimes the most memorable foods are the ones that are both humble and lovingly prepared. A sweet start to the day that lingers in memory long after the last bite. Toast with peanut butter and bananas. For many seniors, toast with peanut butter and bananas was a breakfast that combined simplicity, nutrition, and a touch of indulgence. Long before avocado toast and smoothie bowls became trendy, this humble combination was a go-to in kitchens across America. The base was straightforward: slices of bread, often toasted just enough to be warm and slightly crisp, providing a sturdy canvas for the creamy, salty richness of peanut butter. Spread thickly, it clung to the bread while offering protein and healthy fats, sustaining children and adults alike through school mornings or long work days. Bananas, sliced and layered atop the peanut butter, added a natural sweetness and soft texture that balanced the slightly sticky, savory spread. For families in the mid-20th century, bananas were affordable and widely available, often considered a treat in themselves. Combined with peanut butter, they created a breakfast that was portable, filling, and versatile. Some mornings, a drizzle of honey or a light sprinkle of cinnamon would elevate the dish, while other times, the simplicity of the toast, peanut butter, and banana was enough. The emotional resonance of this meal is strong for those who grew up with it. Seniors recall sitting at the kitchen table with sunlight streaming in, perhaps with a glass of milk or a cup of coffee beside their plate, enjoying the satisfying mix of flavors and textures. It was a breakfast that could be prepared in minutes yet felt nourishing and deliberate, a rare combination in a fast-paced household. Today, toast with peanut butter and bananas enjoys a modern revival, celebrated for its balance of taste and nutrition. Health-conscious eaters and food bloggers alike tout it as a quick, wholesome breakfast. But for those who grew up with it, its significance goes beyond convenience or trendiness. It represents resourcefulness and comfort, a way to make a simple ingredient feel special. It embodies the ingenuity of kitchens that had to make do, turning everyday staples into meals that could satisfy hunger and brighten mornings. For many seniors, it remains a nostalgic reminder that breakfast doesn't need to be elaborate to be memorable. Sometimes, the simplest combinations are the ones that stay with us longest. Cornflakes and early boxed cereals. For seniors who grew up in the first half of the 20th century, cornflakes and other early boxed cereals represent a turning point in breakfast culture. Before the rise of pre-packaged foods, breakfast often meant labor-intensive porridge, bread, or eggs. Cornflakes, introduced in the late 19th century and popularized in the 1920s and 1930s, promised convenience, consistency, and a hint of modernity. A simple bowl of flakes with milk offered something quick, clean, and predictable. No stovetop stirring, no baking required. For busy families, especially in urban areas where time and resources were limited, it was revolutionary. The simplicity of cornflakes belied their cultural impact. They were marketed as healthy, modern, and efficient, a new way to start the day that aligned with changing ideas about nutrition and domestic science. Early boxed cereals weren't just food, they were a statement that breakfast could be quick, easy, and even exciting. For children, the colorful boxes, simple shapes, and occasional collectible prizes made eating cereal an event, not just a meal. Parents appreciated that it was easy to portion, shelf-stable, and relatively mess-free, making mornings smoother in households where everyone had somewhere to be. For many seniors, cornflakes and similar cereals carry a strong nostalgic weight. They evoke memories of sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl in hand, the sound of milk splashing over crisp flakes, the quiet anticipation before school or chores. Unlike hot breakfasts, these cereals required no waiting, no special cooking skill, and no cleanup beyond a simple bowl. They were egalitarian in their accessibility, bridging the gap between urban and rural kitchens and between frugal households and those with a little extra to spend. Today, boxed cereals are ubiquitous, colorful, and often heavily processed. But the early versions were plain, unassuming, and focused on nourishment. For those who remember their first spoonfuls, cornflakes were more than just flakes of toasted corn. They were a symbol of convenience, progress, and a small measure of modern luxury in an otherwise modest kitchen. They remind us that breakfast has always been about more than filling the stomach. It's about the way food adapts to life's pace, reflecting both culture and memory in every crisp, golden bite. Cocoa wheats. For many seniors, cocoa wheats were a breakfast that combined both indulgence and practicality in a way few other cereals could. Emerging in the mid-20th century, These chocolate-flavored wheat cereals offered children the excitement of a sweet start to the day while giving parents a nutritious option that was quick, easy, and affordable. Unlike simple cornflakes, cocoa wheats introduced a playful twist, a hint of cocoa that transformed a routine meal into something special. For households where time was tight and mornings were rushed, they represented convenience without sacrificing a sense of treat or comfort. Cocoa wheats were more than just chocolatey goodness. They were an example of how early boxed cereals reflected the evolving food culture of America. Shipped in sturdy cardboard boxes and sold at an accessible price, they could be stored for weeks, ready to pour into a bowl at a moment's notice. Milk, either fresh or powdered, completed the simple preparation, turning a handful of tiny, crunchy wheat biscuits into a bowl that was both filling and flavorful. Children remembered stirring the milk and listening to the gentle crackle as the cocoa coating softened slightly, releasing a rich, chocolatey aroma that hinted at sweetness without overwhelming the palate. Beyond the flavor, cocoa wheats carried subtle lessons in thrift and resourcefulness. For families on tight budgets, they were a cost-effective way to stretch the morning meal, often accompanied by a piece of fruit or a slice of toast. They were easy to portion, easy to clean up, and could satisfy the appetites of growing children long enough to reach lunch. The ritual of breakfast, pouring the cereal, adding milk, perhaps sneaking a few extra pieces straight from the box, became a comforting part of daily life. Today, cocoa-flavored cereals remain a popular indulgence, often marketed with cartoon mascots and flashy packaging. But for seniors who grew up with cocoa wheats, the memories go deeper than marketing or taste. They recall the quiet mornings around the kitchen table, the simple pleasure of milk and chocolate mingling, and the warmth of a breakfast that felt both nourishing and special. Cocoa wheats weren't just food. They were a small daily joy, a reminder that even modest ingredients could bring delight and leave a lasting impression on childhood mornings. Cinnamon toast under the broiler. For many seniors, cinnamon toast under the broiler is more than a breakfast. It's a memory of warmth, aroma, and the simple pleasures of a kitchen in motion. Before the days of toaster ovens and pre-sliced convenience breads, cinnamon toast was often a weekend treat or a special breakfast for children. Slices of bread, sometimes day-old but still sturdy, were slathered with butter and sprinkled generously with a mixture of sugar and cinnamon. Then came the magical part, placing the toast under the broiler just long enough to caramelize the sugar and lightly brown the edges, creating a crisp, sweet surface that contrasted with the soft bread beneath. Cinnamon toast was the kind of breakfast that felt like a little indulgence, even in households mindful of frugality. Sugar was used sparingly during lean times, so a sprinkle on morning toast was a small luxury, a way to make the simplest ingredient feel special. The broiler, with its intense heat, worked quickly, transforming a humble slice of bread into something almost decadent. Children remember watching through the oven door as the sugar bubbled and browned, the smell of cinnamon and butter filling the air and signaling that breakfast was nearly ready. It was a sensory experience as much as a meal, a combination of visual anticipation, sweet aroma, and satisfying crunch that made the ordinary extraordinary. In many households, cinnamon toast under the broiler was a shared ritual. Parents or older siblings might prepare it in batches, serving plates to sleepy children who were eager to start the day. It was portable, easy to prepare, and filling enough to fuel a morning of school, chores, or play. There was also an element of creativity. Some added a dash of nutmeg or a sprinkle of chopped nuts, while others experimented with thicker slices or richer butter for extra indulgence. Today, cinnamon toast is often relegated to nostalgic cookbooks or quick breakfast hacks. Yet for those who grew up with it, it remains a symbol of comfort and attention to small pleasures. It reminds us that breakfast need not be complicated to be memorable, and that even the simplest ingredients, bread, butter, sugar, and cinnamon, can create warmth, joy, and lasting memories under the glow of a hot broiler. Breakfast casserole: eggs, bread, sausage, and cheese in Pyrex. For many seniors, the breakfast casserole evokes memories of Sunday mornings and family gatherings, a dish that balanced convenience, heartiness, and a sense of occasion. Long before meal prep became a buzzword or Pyrex cookware was celebrated as retro chic, households relied on casseroles to feed a crowd with minimal fuss. This particular combination, eggs, bread, sausage, and cheese, was both practical and indulgent. Stale bread found new life in the dish, absorbing the rich custard of beaten eggs, while sausage added savory depth and cheese melted into every crevice, creating a comforting, golden blanket of flavor that could feed multiple people at once. The beauty of the breakfast casserole lay in its simplicity and adaptability. Housewives and working mothers in mid-century America quickly discovered that it could be assembled the night before, refrigerated, and baked in the morning, saving precious time while still delivering a satisfying meal. Leftover bread and odds and ends of cheese or meat were transformed into something substantial, reflecting both thrift and creativity. For children, waking to the aroma of a bubbling Pyrex dish emerging from the oven was a delight. It promised a breakfast that was filling, flavorful, and more exciting than cereal or toast alone. Emotionally, the casserole carries the warmth of shared tables and family togetherness. Seniors often remember gathering around the kitchen table, plates heaped with slices of golden brown casserole, accompanied by a glass of milk or a steaming cup of coffee. It was both nourishment and ritual, a way to start the day with comfort and community. In times when households were bustling and mornings chaotic, the casserole was a reliable anchor, offering sustenance and a sense of order. Today, breakfast casseroles have found a place in brunch culture, often spruced up with gourmet cheeses, fresh herbs, or artisanal sausages. Yet for those who grew up with the classic version, it remains a nostalgic symbol of practicality, family, and home-cooked love. It reminds us that breakfast doesn't need to be complicated to be memorable. Sometimes a humble Pyrex dish filled with eggs, bread, sausage, and cheese can create the most lasting memories, combining frugality, flavor, and the comforting essence of a shared meal. Biscuits with sorghum syrup. For many seniors, biscuits with sorghum syrup are a taste of both home and history, a breakfast that evokes memories of simpler times in kitchens filled with warmth. Long before maple syrup became a staple at the breakfast table, sorghum syrup, thick, dark, and richly sweet, was a common accompaniment in southern and rural households. Made from the juice of sorghum cane, it carried an earthy depth that set it apart from other sweeteners. Spread generously over warm, freshly baked biscuits, it transformed a humble staple into a meal that felt indulgent without straying from practicality. Biscuits themselves were often made from scratch, using flour, lard, or butter, and buttermilk if available. They were hearty, tender, and slightly crumbly, perfect for soaking up the sticky syrup. In many households, leftover biscuits were pressed into service for breakfast, warming overnight bread under the broiler or in a skillet, then drizzled with sorghum. The combination was simple, but the flavors were memorable, the savory richness of the biscuit balanced by the deep, molasses-like sweetness of the syrup, creating a satisfying contrast that delighted both children and adults. Sorghum syrup and biscuits were more than just food. They represented resourcefulness and family traditions. In times when sugar was expensive or rationed, sorghum syrup provided an affordable, shelf-stable alternative. Families relied on it not only for breakfast, but also for baking, glazes, and occasional treats. The ritual of breakfast, splitting the biscuits, pouring the syrup, and gathering around the table, was as much about connection as it was about sustenance. Seniors often recall the aroma of baking biscuits mingling with the dark, rich scent of sorghum, the sound of syrup dripping onto a plate, and the simple pleasure of biting into something warm, sweet, and homemade. Today, sorghum syrup is less common in modern kitchens, often replaced by honey, maple syrup, or store-bought pancake syrups. Yet for those who grew up with it, the taste carries an unmatched sense of nostalgia. Biscuits with sorghum syrup are a reminder of frugality, tradition, and the comforting power of simple ingredients. They teach that a meal does not need to be elaborate to be memorable, and that some of the most enduring flavors come from ingenuity, patience, and a touch of sweetness at the breakfast table. Country ham and red-eye gravy. For many seniors, country ham with red-eye gravy is the breakfast that defined Sunday mornings and special occasions. A dish steeped in Southern tradition and culinary ingenuity. Unlike the neatly packaged ham found in grocery stores today, country ham was dry-cured, salty, and robust in flavor, often hung to age for months in smokehouses or pantries. It was a product of preservation, born out of necessity when refrigeration was scarce. Yet over time, it became a celebrated symbol of resourcefulness and taste. Slices were cut thick or thin, fried slowly in a cast-iron skillet until the edges crisped and the fat rendered, releasing a savory aroma that would fill the kitchen. Red-eye gravy, the ham's perfect companion, was deceptively simple but unforgettable. Made from the drippings left in the skillet after frying the ham and deglazed with a splash of black coffee, it carried a salty, slightly bitter edge that cut through the richness of the meat. The resulting sauce was poured over the ham and often biscuits or grits, enhancing the flavor and ensuring none of the savory goodness went to waste. It was a breakfast of efficiency, making the most of what was available while delivering a meal that felt indulgent. For many seniors, country ham and red-eye gravy evoke strong emotional resonance. It was a dish tied to family rituals, church gatherings, and holiday breakfasts, moments when the household gathered to share a hearty, flavorful meal. Children remember the sizzle of ham hitting the hot skillet, the smell of coffee mingling with the smoke-cured meat, and the anticipation as plates were set around the table. It was a meal that required patience and attention, yet it rewarded both the cook and the diners with flavor and satisfaction. Today, country ham and red-eye gravy are less common in everyday breakfasts, but are celebrated in Southern cuisine and brunch culture. For those who grew up with it, the dish is more than a meal. It is a reminder of history, tradition, and the ingenuity of kitchens that transformed preserved foods into something memorable. Country ham and red-eye gravy teach that flavor often comes from patience, care, and respect for ingredients, and that a truly memorable breakfast can be both simple and extraordinary. Rice and gravy for breakfast. For many seniors, rice and gravy for breakfast was a humble yet satisfying way to start the day, a dish rooted in frugality and Southern culinary tradition. Before breakfast became a standardized meal of cereal, toast, or eggs. Many households relied on what was available, affordable, and filling. Leftover rice from the previous night's supper was often transformed into a hearty morning dish, smothered in a savory gravy made from pan drippings, butter, or bits of meat. It was simple, quick to prepare, and designed to stretch resources, reflecting both thrift and creativity in the kitchen. The appeal of rice and gravy lay in its comforting texture and flavor. Warm, fluffy grains of rice absorbed the richness of the gravy, creating a meal that was soft, savory, and deeply satisfying. Families often added small bits of sausage, ham, or bacon to enrich the gravy, but even a plain version carried a satisfying weight, enough to fuel children for school or adults for long work days. The aroma of the gravy mingling with the steam from the rice filled the kitchen with a sense of home, signaling both nourishment and routine. For many seniors, this dish carries strong emotional resonance. It evokes memories of early mornings when parents or grandparents prepared breakfast quickly yet lovingly, ensuring the family started the day with something substantial. It was a dish that exemplified resourcefulness, showing that even leftovers could be transformed into something hearty and flavorful. The ritual of scooping rice onto a plate and ladling gravy over it became a comforting routine, a small but meaningful act of care in households where every ingredient mattered. Today, rice and gravy for breakfast is less common, often overshadowed by more modern or convenience-focused meals. Yet for those who grew up with it, the dish remains a nostalgic reminder of resilience, simplicity, and ingenuity. It highlights how necessity shaped culinary tradition, teaching that even the most modest ingredients can create a meal that is both filling and memorable. Rice and gravy for breakfast was never about luxury. It was about sustenance, warmth, and the quiet satisfaction of a family fed with love and practicality. Sweet potato pancakes. For many seniors, sweet potato pancakes evoke memories of autumn mornings, family gatherings, and the comforting aroma of a kitchen filled with warmth and sweetness. Long before pre-packaged mixes and instant batters, these pancakes were crafted from humble, readily available ingredients: mashed sweet potatoes, flour, eggs, and a touch of sugar or spice. The natural sweetness of the potatoes lent the pancakes a moist, tender texture, while cinnamon, nutmeg, or a hint of vanilla elevated their flavor without the need for fancy additions. For households during the Great Depression or wartime rationing, sweet potato pancakes were a way to stretch ingredients and create a satisfying meal that could feed multiple family members. Preparation was straightforward but required care. Mashed sweet potatoes were mixed with eggs and a bit of flour to bind them, then dropped by spoonfuls onto a hot buttered skillet. The batter, slightly denser than traditional pancakes, browned to a golden perfection, creating a lightly crisp exterior while remaining soft and sweet inside. Children remembered the anticipation as the pancakes cooked, the smell of sweet potatoes mingling with butter filling the kitchen, promising a breakfast that was both hearty and comforting. Served with butter, a drizzle of syrup, or a sprinkle of powdered sugar, they became an indulgent treat that felt special without being extravagant. Sweet potato pancakes were more than just food. They were a reflection of resourcefulness and tradition. In many households, leftover baked or boiled sweet potatoes found a second life in these pancakes, ensuring nothing went to waste. Seniors often recall sitting around the table, sharing a stack of pancakes with siblings, savoring each bite, and relishing the small comforts of home. The dish became a symbol of family, warmth, and creativity, showing that even the simplest ingredients could yield something memorable and satisfying. Today, sweet potato pancakes appear on brunch menus or in holiday recipes, celebrated for their flavor and nutrition. Yet for those who grew up with them, they are deeply nostalgic, a reminder of a time when breakfast was a labor of love, patience, and ingenuity. Sweet potato pancakes teach that food can nourish both body and memory, offering sweetness, warmth, and the enduring comfort of home. Hoppin' John, black-eyed peas, rice bacon. For many seniors, Hoppin' John evokes memories of southern kitchens, family tables, and the comforting aroma of a hearty home-cooked meal. Traditionally made with black-eyed peas, rice, and a bit of pork, often bacon or ham hock. Hoppin' John was more than just a breakfast or New Year's dish. It was a testament to frugality, resourcefulness, and flavor. Black-eyed peas were inexpensive, shelf-stable, and packed with protein, while rice provided bulk and sustenance. Bacon or a small piece of salt pork added richness and depth without requiring expensive cuts of meat. Together, these ingredients formed a meal that was nourishing, economical, and deeply satisfying. Preparation was straightforward but required attention. The peas were often soaked overnight to soften them, then simmered with aromatics and a piece of pork until tender. Rice was cooked separately and fluffed to perfection, ready to receive the rich, savory mixture of peas and pork. Once combined, Hoppin' John became a comforting, slightly smoky and hearty dish. For children, the contrast between the tender peas, the fluffy rice, and the savory pork made every bite interesting and flavorful. The aroma of bacon sizzling in the skillet and peas simmering on the stove filled kitchens with warmth, signaling a meal that was both substantial and lovingly prepared. Hoppin' John carries more than culinary value. It embodies cultural and familial significance. Many seniors remember it as a New Year's tradition, believed to bring luck and prosperity. But it also appeared in everyday breakfasts when households needed something filling and dependable. Its ability to transform modest pantry staples into a memorable meal demonstrates the ingenuity of cooks who could stretch resources while still providing flavor and satisfaction. Today, Hoppin' John may appear on modern brunch menus or in Southern-themed restaurants, sometimes enhanced with fresh herbs or gourmet bacon. Yet for those who grew up with it, it remains a symbol of home, family, and tradition. It teaches that the simplest ingredients, black-eyed peas, rice, and a bit of pork, can combine to create a meal that nourishes the body and warms the heart. A dish that carries both history and memory in every savory, soulful bite. Buttered hominy. For many seniors, buttered hominy is a dish that evokes quiet mornings, simple kitchens, and the comforting warmth of a meal that is both humble and satisfying. Hominy, made from dried corn kernels treated with an alkaline solution to remove the hull, was a staple in southern and rural households for generations. It was inexpensive, shelf-stable, and versatile, providing both sustenance and a blank canvas for flavor. When boiled until tender and then generously coated with butter, hominy transformed from a plain, hearty grain into a breakfast dish that was creamy, rich, and deeply satisfying. Preparation was straightforward yet rewarding. The dried kernels were soaked and boiled, sometimes for an hour or more until they swelled and softened, producing a texture both tender and slightly chewy. Once drained, a generous pat of butter was stirred in, melting into the kernels and creating a glossy, flavorful coating. Some households added a pinch of salt or a dash of pepper, while others favored a bit of sugar for a subtly sweet variation. Served hot, buttered hominy was a simple comfort, its gentle flavor providing nourishment without fuss, perfect for starting the day on a filling note. The dish carries strong emotional resonance for seniors who grew up with it. Many recall early mornings before school or chores, when the aroma of cooking hominy filled the kitchen and called the family to the table. It was a dish that reflected thrift and ingenuity, transforming a basic, inexpensive grain into a meal that could sustain children and adults alike. For many, buttered hominy was more than sustenance. It was a small ritual, a way to begin the day with a sense of home and routine. Today, hominy is often associated with grits or used in soups and stews, but the simplicity of buttered hominy remains a nostalgic treasure. It reminds seniors that even the most modest ingredients, handled with care and paired with something as simple as butter, can create a meal that is comforting, filling, and memorable. Buttered hominy teaches that breakfast doesn't need to be elaborate to be satisfying. It is a dish that nourishes both body and memory, connecting generations through the quiet, enduring pleasure of home cooking. Collard greens and cornbread. For many seniors, collard greens and cornbread are more than just a meal. They are a cornerstone of Southern culinary tradition, a dish steeped in history, family, and resilience. Collard greens, with their deep green leaves and earthy flavor, were a staple in households that needed affordable, nutritious food. Often simmered slowly with a bit of fat, salt, and sometimes smoked meat, they absorbed rich flavors while softening into tender, flavorful leaves. Paired with cornbread made from simple ingredients like cornmeal, water or buttermilk, and a touch of fat, the combination became a comforting, filling, and affordable breakfast or side that could feed a family without extravagance. Preparation of collard greens was a labor of love. Leaves were washed meticulously, stems removed, and the greens chopped before simmering them slowly in a seasoned pot. The addition of smoked pork, bacon, or ham hocks gave the dish a depth and savoriness that balanced the green's natural bitterness. Cornbread, meanwhile, was baked in a hot cast iron skillet, producing a golden crust and a soft, crumbly interior. Often served warm, the cornbread could be broken into pieces and used to scoop up the greens, creating a tactile, interactive eating experience that reinforced the communal aspect of the meal. For many seniors, collard greens and cornbread evoke memories of family kitchens, Sunday mornings, and community gatherings. The dish was practical yet celebratory, a way to nourish large households with inexpensive ingredients while maintaining flavor and satisfaction. Children remember the steam rising from a skillet of cornbread and the aroma of simmering greens filling the house, signaling both comfort and care. It was a dish that taught lessons in patience, resourcefulness, and appreciation for simple, wholesome ingredients. Today, collard greens and cornbread remain a beloved symbol of Southern cuisine, appearing on breakfast, lunch, and dinner tables alike. Yet for those who grew up with it, the dish carries nostalgia beyond taste. It is a reminder of resilience, family, and the ingenuity of home cooking. Collard greens and cornbread show that even the simplest, most affordable ingredients, when handled with care and love, can create a meal that nourishes both body and memory, connecting generations through the enduring power of shared food. Homemade cinnamon rolls, or sticky buns. For many seniors, homemade cinnamon rolls or sticky buns are more than a breakfast treat. They're a symbol of family, patience, and the comforting rhythms of a home kitchen. Long before store-bought versions or pre-made dough, these sweet pastries required time, care, and a touch of ingenuity. Flour, sugar, butter, eggs, and yeast were transformed through kneading, rising, and rolling into soft, fragrant rolls filled with cinnamon and sugar. Sticky buns added an extra layer of indulgence with the caramel or brown sugar glaze, often studded with nuts, dripping over the edges as the rolls baked. The process of making cinnamon rolls was as much a part of the experience as eating them. Dough needed to be kneaded until smooth, left to rise in a warm corner, and then rolled out to be spread with butter and a cinnamon sugar mixture. The rolls were carefully coiled, cut, and arranged in a pan, allowing time for a second rise before baking. The transformation from raw dough to golden, aromatic rolls filled the home with a sense of anticipation. Children remember gathering around the kitchen table, inhaling the sweet, spicy aroma, and eagerly waiting for the rolls to cool just enough to pull apart and savor. These pastries were a way to celebrate ordinary mornings or mark special occasions without extravagance. They were often made from ingredients already on hand, stretching flour, sugar, and butter into a luxurious breakfast that felt like a treat. Seniors recall the tactile pleasure of kneading dough, the sticky fingers from caramel glaze, and the joy of sharing the warm rolls with siblings or neighbors. It was a dish that combined practicality with indulgence, teaching lessons in patience, resourcefulness, and the delight of homemade food. Today, cinnamon rolls and sticky buns remain popular in bakeries and brunch menus, often with fancy toppings or commercial shortcuts. Yet for those who grew up with homemade versions, the memory is sweeter than any convenience product. They carry the scent of nostalgia, family togetherness, and the pride of creating something from scratch. Homemade cinnamon rolls or sticky buns remind us that the most memorable breakfasts are often those made with care, time, and a little sweetness, turning simple ingredients into lasting memories of warmth and home. And there you have it. 30 breakfast dishes that seniors remember fondly from their childhoods, each one a taste of nostalgia, comfort, and family tradition. Which of these dishes brings back the strongest memories for you? Share your favorite childhood breakfast in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with friends who love a taste of the past. Let's keep these classic breakfasts alive, one nostalgic bite at a time.